Happy Friday, everybody. It's Catherine Kowalchuk, and it's June the 28th, 2024. And welcome to another episode of the Responsibility Quotient podcast. Sorry about this delayed interview, but given schedules and breakdown in vehicles, we finally have Billboard Chris joining the podcast today. I've been following Chris for a couple of years now, and he is a dad. He lives in British Columbia. He has two children, and he is, from what I can tell, extremely distraught, I think, and concerned about what is happening to our youth and how our governments and our medical establishment are pushing very dangerous treatments through the use of puberty blockers and peddling the dangerous ideology, pseudo religion known as gender ideology upon our children. And I share the same points of view, I think. I don't know much about Chris, but he has been globe-trotting. And if you're not familiar with Chris, he is the individual, the dad that attends various places, rallies, etc., with a billboard on. And from what I can tell, his demeanor and approach is very rational, very calm. And what he uncovers from what I see on his videos that he posts, he is met with a lot of resistance. And so I'm hoping that we're going to cover his journey through raising awareness about gender ideology and puberty blockers vis-a-vis children, and also about some of the stuff that he's encountered as well regarding freedom of expression and censorship. And in particular, a lawsuit that I think Elon Musk is part of that involves not necessarily Chris directly, but certainly touches on the topic of freedom of expression. So without further ado, welcome, Chris, to the Responsibility Quotient podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. So that lawsuit is not technically a lawsuit. We're appealing a takedown order in Australia where they have a person called the E-Safety Commissioner. This is an American woman named Julian Grant, and her job is to control what Australians say and see on the internet. So they ordered one of my posts taken down when I was critical of a woman named Teddy Cook, a woman who now says she's a man, a woman who's been appointed to this UN panel, actually World Health Organization panel of 20 so-called experts to draft the healthcare policy for trans-identified adults and children. Yet this is a person who promotes bestiality, bondage, porn, mutilation, drugs, and taxpayer-funded childhood sex change surgeries. And I don't think this is the type of person who should be drafting healthcare policy. So I wrote a post basically saying that people who belong in psychiatric wards shouldn't be writing the policy for people who belong in psychiatric wards. And it wasn't my nicest tweet in the history of the world, but the Australian E-Safety Commissioner ordered it taken down. It's geo-blocked in Australia. So I filed an appeal. Then X filed an appeal. So there's technically two separate cases going on. But we're kind of joined, and I'm working directly with X's lawyers as well, because this is an attack on freedom of speech. So yeah, I've got that going on. And otherwise, I just travel around having conversations with people all around the world about what I consider to be the greatest child abuse scandal in modern medicine history, this business of trying to change the sex of children. And you mentioned I meet a lot of resistance. That is true. There is certainly resistance, and it's very loud and angry. But I always like to stress that more than 90% of the population overwhelmingly support what I do. So I think the resistance is really small. They're just loud and angry, and they get a lot of attention.
Well, that is true. I mean, a lot of people do say that there is such a small minority of people that are pushing it. One of the concerns I have around this, being a mother of two and a stepmother to two as well, my focus has always been on resisting and bringing to the attention of whomever I can about the harms that we are inflicting on our children. And this, I couldn't agree more with you about your characterization of what's happening right now. And but it does trouble me that our institutions, our universities, our governments, our healthcare uh, providers, the colleges in many jurisdictions are promoting this. In Alberta, Danielle Smith, our premier, just recently advised Albertans that she is going to legalize puberty blockers for minors who are 16 years and 17 years old, and so long as they have their consent of their parents. And she's also committed to bringing in top-notch mutilation doctors who perform this type of surgery. And so
So what
it
she's
might,
doing,
so you say,
I just want to make
sure,
a small correction there because it's technically already legal. She's not legalizing
yes,
it. She wants to make it illegal for kids under 16 to get puberty blockers, whereas that's already currently happening. So technically this is an improvement. It's kind of a half measure as far as I'm concerned because 16 and 17-year-olds still shouldn't be getting this. But it is an improvement, and she's the first premier to take these steps. But yeah, I don't agree with wanting to bring in currently the only private clinic in Canada is in Montreal where people get these sex reassignment surgeries, the bottom surgeries that they call them, the euphemistic term for it. And they want to bring in their own experts into Alberta. And I wouldn't really bother doing that. But she is certainly taking positive measures to put a stop to at least some of this child abuse.
well, for me, for me personally, I'm pretty black and white about this issue insofar as children are concerned, and I really don't believe that it's actually going to help the cause. Continuing to allow 16-year-old and 17-year-olds to mutilate themselves and take chemical castration drugs, but nonetheless, um, I'm curious to know from you about your journey. How did you start off? How long have you been doing this? And where, and then ultimately where you think that this is going to go, given that you have such a close connection with people, on the street, face to face, as you tour the world, spreading your message of I guess concern and probably hope as well.
Oh yeah, there's tons of hope. We're going to put a stop to this. And measures like Danielle Smith is taking are 100% an improvement because 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds won't be getting these drugs anymore. So that's an improvement. And you can't always get exactly what you
Yeah.
want at first. Sometimes you have to do this in increments. So that's what they're doing there. And I'm sure in time it'll extend to other ages as well. Like we saw in Florida, they banned teaching of sexual orientation and gender identity from kindergarten to grade 3. The left lost their minds and called this the Don't Say Gay bill, even though it was called the Parental Rights in Education bill.
Hmm.
And then afterwards, the Board of Education in Florida improved upon that and they stopped the teaching of sexual orientation and gender identity all the way through to grade 12. So sometimes you take what you can get and then you continue to improve. But we're seeing improvements all over the world. I've always had 100% confidence that we would put a stop to this because it's too crazy to last. People just didn't know what was going on. But we have had this stopped. No more puberty blockers are being given in England. No more puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones are being given in Scotland. Even under their Labour Party, they went further than the NHS in England. We've seen basically a total curtailment of this in Sweden and Finland. Germany's making progress. The Academy of Medicine in France has publicly stated that there's no way to tell which of these kids will grow up and out of their gender dysphoria and which won't. And the Senate is now working on legislation to put a stop to this. 25 states in the US have put a stop to it, all Republican states, of course. And a lot of those states are now involved in lawsuits because the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, sees it as a civil right to sterilize and maim children. So they sue in every one of these states. Biden's Department of Justice is also suing in a lot of these states. But this is now going to the Supreme Court, which is tremendous. And there are several individual lawsuits that have begun from detransitioners, from children who have been harmed. So lawfare is going to put a final nail in the coffin of this. But Canada's probably going to be the last to fix this, and it goes province to province, just like in the United States, it goes state to state because each state and province are responsible for their own healthcare. But we will get it done eventually. It's just that these child abusing politicians and ideologically captured doctors, and I really do consider this to be a cult for all practical purposes. It has all the hallmarks of a cult. But these people just don't want to acknowledge the truth, but we'll get there.
Can you explain? So from your research and insight, when did this really start?
Well, so technically this started back in the 60s with John Money, and a man named Robert Stoller was the first to coin the term gender identity. But John Money was more interested in people with these disorders of sexual development, or what trans activists currently call intersex disorders, which is a misnomer because these people aren't inter anything. They're all male or female, but they have various disorders of sexual development, various medical conditions, which people try to wrap under one big umbrella called intersex, but they're all different conditions. And anyway, John Money was doing these experiments. He basically theorized that if he raised a little boy as a girl, there would be no difference in the child's functioning between other girls. And he experimented on this little boy named David Reimer, who at 8 months of age went to get a circumcision. These were two twin boys, the Reimer twins, born to a couple in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And at 8 months of age, they went to get a circumcision, and this device malfunctioned and basically burned this little boy's penis right off. The mother saw some advertisement for John Money's research and got in touch with him. And together, the parents and John Money raised this boy as a girl. They castrated him completely. They made a fake vagina for him. They didn't tell him he was a boy. They dressed him in girls' clothes. And it's a long, tragic story. John Money is a pedophile 100%. He had these boys doing sexual things to each other. And when they were adults, they both ended up committing suicide. But from that research was born this theory of gender identity. This belief that our gender is a social construct separate from our sex. And normal people have used gender as a synonym for sex for the longest time, but the left have taken the word gender to mean something else entirely. Yet when you ask them what it means, nobody can define it, which is one reason this thing has actually grown, because it's so confusing, nobody gets it. And when people are confused, they don't know how to talk about things. And so then they just don't talk about it. But this idea that we all have a gender identity, which is entirely based on sexist regressive stereotypes, based on your behavior. So if you're a more masculine girl or you're a more girly man, apparently this means you might be transgender. All based on stereotypes. So if a girl likes to climb trees and play in the dirt and throw around the football and chase lizards, well, maybe she has a male gender identity because those are more masculine characteristics. But this is, of course, just sexist and regressive and totally stupid. So there's no truth to it at all. But this really picked up steam in the 70s and 80s and 90s with feminist theory. You have these feminist scholars like Judith Butler out of Berkeley teaching this gender is a social construct nonsense. And so all these modern day feminists, the intersectional feminists, the women who are upset about the patriarchy don't even know what a woman is anymore. And they're predominantly the ones pushing this ideology in society today. It's young women under the age of 30 who have really bought into this. 90% of the abuse I get on the street comes from young women. The guys aren't really having it, but they graduate university and they become the teachers and the healthcare workers and the counselors and the HR employees. And it's a long story because there are other things involved here, but through activism, they've been successful in getting governments to adopt this and medical bodies to adopt it. And it's become this thing where suddenly it blew up around 2010, 2015, thanks to social media. And when gay rights were won, the objectives for all of these nonprofit organizations became trans rights, and they were successful at conflating these two. But really, they have almost nothing to do with each other. We should separate the LGB from the TQ, because this is about a denial of reality itself. And a queer theory is an attempt to destroy all the norms in society. So it's just one of those things that there's been this perfect storm that's helped it to grow, and nobody wanted to speak up against it because then they'd be called some bigot against the LGBTQ community. But people are finally learning the truth and learning how to speak about this, and we're gradually putting a stop to it.
Yeah. So can you tell me about like what's a day in your life like when you attend these venues or public spaces? How long do you go for, and is it targeted? How Tell me a little bit
So
more about that.
So my days vary dramatically, especially now because I do a lot of other things behind the scenes. I'm talking with parents. I'm dealing with other conservative organizations. I work with a lot of conservative organizations in the U.S. I do public speaking. I go to conferences. But when I'm outside on my street, that's still my bread and butter. And I just go to busy downtown centers, and I go to a lot of university campuses. Some people see me at the odd pride event or something, and they think that's what I do. That's really not what I do. I've only gone to a handful of those, but those tend to get a lot of views because there's a lot of unhinged, angry people who try to stop me from speaking with others. And the internet loves the drama, so that's what gets seen more. But the majority of the time, I'm just having nice, normal, rational conversations with people on the street in order to educate them, because my campaign is really about education. Because I know when people
Mhm.
learn what's going on, they'll be able to protect their own kids. And for every 1,000 people I speak to, 3 or 4 of those are going to become active in fighting this themselves. So part of what I do is about activating others and helping to educate others so they can fight back in their own jurisdictions where they live.
There's been in the, I guess, internet. I don't really watch the news anymore, but online I've noticed that some organizations have been called out recently with respect to their, I guess, so-called advocacy about this. WPAC being one of them, and that's a study that has come out regarding puberty blockers. Can you maybe share some more information for the audience about what those two topics are revealing?
Sure. So there have been a number of systematic reviews that have been done. So systematic review is really the gold standard in medicine for looking at all of the evidence. They look at all the different scientific literature that's been compiled over time, and they review it all, and they come up with their conclusions. And these reviews have been done recently in England. The one that you might be referring to is called the Cass Review. It was done by a
Yeah.
pediatrician named Dr. Hilary Cass, and she did this review all over almost 4 years. The report is 388 pages long. But basically, what it says is there's no evidence for transitioning kids. There's no evidence this is helping them. And there never has been. But they're putting a stop to this there in England now. No more puberty blockers. They've taken a very cautious approach, and I disagree with their approach. They're still allowing kids to receive cross sex hormones, the opposite sex's hormones. But that'll end up being put a stop to as well. But these other reviews were also done in Sweden and Finland and Germany recently. And same conclusions in all of them because they're all looking at the same scientific literature, which is that the evidence base for transitioning kids is there's basically none of it.
Is there
And
are
the
there any
small studies that have been done are very poor quality.
are there any studies out there that, I mean, this whole idea that you can change your sex is pretty ludicrous to me. Um, it's impossible.
Mhm.
It's impossible. So, is there anything in the medical literature that is claiming that it is possible?
No. Now, activists want to redefine what normal terms mean. They want to redefine gender to mean just a feeling. So if you feel like a woman, then you are a woman. Well, when these people tell me these things, I say, well, what does that mean to feel like a woman?
Yeah. Well, I would like to know too, because I'd like to know what it feels like to be a woman.
Is it a
You know,
feeling? Yeah.
well,
So,
exactly. Like, I mean, I had a guest on who's a good friend of mine who's transgender a little while ago, and um, I was curious about that exact topic because I don't know what it feels like to be a woman. I know what it feels like to be Catherine, and the things that I feel as an individual, but I've never really thought of myself as I feel like a woman today, or I feel feminine, or I wouldn't know the difference. And so this whole thing is fascinating to me that somebody can take a feeling and completely co-opt it to mean something that so drastic as to think that it's the opposite sex.
Right. So this has evolved over time. So historically, there was a condition which they called it gender identity disorder. Now, I'm going to qualify all of these statements by saying gender doesn't exist. Sex exists. If you want to use gender as a synonym for sex, fine, I guess. But I wouldn't do that in this day and age because the word gender has become unhinged from the word sex and it just confuses people. So I say there are two sexes, there are zero genders, and there are infinite personalities. And that just captures everybody. Nobody
Yeah.
is transgender. Transition is something people do. It's not something they are. And it's just body modification. That's all it is. Now, historically, there were people with this condition, which in the DSM, it used to be called gender identity disorder. In 2013, they changed that to gender dysphoria because I guess calling it a disorder was hurting too many people's feelings. But this used to affect mostly boys, starting from a young age, really effeminate little boys, and a majority of them grew up to be gay. And when you look at all of the academic studies that were done before they started giving kids puberty blockers, which really started to take off this century, but if you look at all the studies done before that, the vast majority of these kids simply grew out of their gender dysphoria. It desisted. The most recent study that was completed before the whole puberty blocker craze finished in 2004. It followed 139 boys from the age of 5 all the way into their 20s. 87.8% of them just grew out of it. 63.6% grew up to be gay. Now keep in mind, this was when it affected about 1 out of 30,000 kids. Depending on the time span you look at, it's 1 out of 30,000, even less. This was an extremely rare thing. But with these teachings in academia and with the gay rights movement, with all the victories there, the people who warned about the slippery slope were proved to be correct. All of these TQ organizations aren't just going to shut the doors and say, yay, we achieved our goals. They always have a new objective. For leftists, they don't want a revolution. They want to be in a perpetual state of revolution. So they're always pushing for the next thing. And the next thing after gay rights were won were trans rights. And, they've been successful in turning what is a mental illness into a civil rights movement. And thanks to social media, and thanks to getting gender ideology into schools, this has now spread like wildfire among girls. It's exploded among girls. It's now 3-to-1 girls versus boys who go to these gender clinics. And for kids socially transitioning, it's even higher than that. So social transition is just changing names and pronouns, not necessarily doing the medicalization. But yeah, this has just exploded. And these kids who predominantly have autism or have suffered sexual abuse or have anxiety or depression or eating disorders or are cutting or have some other mental health comorbidities going on, kids who are in state care are way overrepresented. Here in British Columbia, we have one psychologist named Wallace Wong who works for the Ministry of Children and Family Development. He's a government employee. He gave a talk at the Vancouver Public Library where he said he's transitioning over 1,000 kids, including more than 500 in state care. We only have 6,000 kids in state care. 8% of all of them are being transitioned by one psychologist who sends them to the children's hospital where they get their puberty blockers, hormones, and surgeries. So this is just child abuse, pure and simple. This is a cult because there's no such thing as a gender identity. Essentially, they believe we have a gendered soul. That if you're more female on the inside or male on the inside, whatever that means, nobody can define it, then you are male or female. And they don't allow themselves to look at the evidence. They self-police their own thoughts. They try to stop anyone else from talking about it. They cut themselves off from their own family members, or other people encourage them to do so. It's all these cult-like attributes to this. And apparently we're not allowed to talk about it. That makes us a bigot. Really? We should be able to talk about anything. But now we're turning children into anorgasmic, sterilized, lifelong pharmaceutical patients, and we're not supposed to talk about that? We're not supposed to express concern? It's outrageous.
It is outrageous, and I'm actually quite shocked at how successful this psychological operation, brainwashing, has been on the population by and large, especially in Canada. And the fact that we have a government who's completely unhinged from reality in wanting to bring forward legislation such as Bill C-63 to really make and Bill C-4 as well, which changed the definition of conversion therapy, and also makes affirming non-affirming children a big deal and a criminal offense in some cases. So, you know, the fact that, I was on your Twitter handle. um I do follow you, but I was looking at your Twitter stuff, and I'm just going to put that up for people on the thing here for them to find you. And you're chronicling recently on your Twitter profile about your experience where the police really were standing down as you were being physically assaulted. Can you tell us a
Yeah.
little bit more
So
about that?
this particular incident, and I've been assaulted more than 30 times, but this particular incident was last March of 2023. And the reason I'm highlighting it again, and I'm going to put up the entire hour of what happened on this day, but the Vancouver police are being investigated by I forget the name of the office, but the police officers, their conduct is now being investigated into this day, where there were numerous assaults, not just against me, but some other people. But I went to this Transgender Day of Visibility thing in Vancouver, and within seconds of getting there, I was assaulted. My sign was graffitied, and someone knocked it up into my face, and it left my nose bleeding. And I was mobbed and swarmed and pushed, of course. And so I called the police, and there was a young female police officer who arrived pretty quickly. And I walked over to her car, and I said, I could tell right away she was a problem, but I said I should be able to walk freely in Canada without getting assaulted. And her response was, well, and I knew instantly I had a big problem. She literally said maybe I scratched myself, like cut my own nose. And
Oh.
she refused to investigate. She kind of reluctantly put on a show of wanting to do it, but then did nothing. And it was a bit of a crazy scene. There ended up being about 30 police officers who showed up. And all of these trans activists wouldn't leave me alone. I was trying to talk to a journalist. I walked away from this mob twice. They kept following me. And then I was surrounded. I was giving this interview. Two men who each identify as women were screaming in my ear from each side, F you, F you, F you, over and over again. People were surrounding me from behind. And one of those screams hurt my ear, so I just put my hand up for like a little space, and I actually wanted to get out of there. But I didn't even push, and that was enough to justify this man to punch me in the face, throat punch, grabbed my shirt, pulled on me. The other guy pushed on me simultaneously from behind. So I took a bit of a tumble. But this was all in the presence of 30 officers who had already done nothing to de-escalate the situation. Technically, I was already getting assaulted when they're screaming in my ear. Mm-hmm. And then I take that right in front of them, and no arrests were made. And no charges were ever approved. So the guy walks away free, and the female officer who was in charge of the investigation said that I instigated. She said that it was a mutual fight, and you can all watch this video for yourselves, and that I'd been yelling at people. And I have literally every second of my whole day there recorded, so I'm going to post the whole thing. And I'm working with the police now who are investigating themselves. So we'll see what happens. But in Canada, the police response has been woeful on way too many occasions. Of course, there are good police officers out there. But in the States, I get way better treatment. It's like night and day. So some of these police forces are captured too, because especially in the cities, you end up with these woke police chiefs responding to their woke police mayors. And that just kind of filters down through the force.
How did the investigation get initiated?
Well, I just found out this week they had initiated this investigation last year, but then they put it on hold because, unbeknownst to me, they actually were trying to press charges against this man, but the Crown prosecutor declined to approve the charge. So that was all pretty recent that I found that out. And so now that the criminal investigation is over with and there won't be any charges, now they're looking into the police conduct again. Because the Vancouver police must have received hundreds of complaints. The video was seen 40 million times just from my Twitter account. Never mind all the other people posting about it. And I know they were inundated with complaints, so they started their own investigation.
Wow. I hope that something positive and that people are held accountable in that. But it's a systemic problem, and you're right. When these establishments are led by people with a woke worldview, we see massive transformations and inaction in not only this area but others as well. We saw that with the trucker convoy, and surprisingly, we're seeing this as well with the protests, the pro-Palestinian protests. But I wonder about those. I mean, that's a different topic altogether. But I just wonder if those people, if there's a crossover, like if you're seeing like the same people in these different protests being um, mobilized.
Yes. So here's the thing about leftism. Church for leftists is protest. That's their church. They love it. This is what they live for. So the leftists, of course, are interested, as I said earlier, in perpetual revolution. And for them, the enemy is whoever's the most successful, whoever's in power. So that's why they hate the Jews, because the Jews are successful. That's why they hate white people. White males are at the top of the oppression pyramid, of course. And they believe that we're living on stolen land. So the leftists will come out in support of these pro-Hamas protests. And they'll be there to support the Muslims, who they see as an oppressed group. But none of the Muslims support gender ideology. So these leftists who come out, Antifa, whoever, they're all in support of gender ideology, without a doubt. And then they're there to support these pro-Hamas protesters. But then someone like me comes along, and these intersectionality, there's a crash. And if you want to look up a really hilarious video, I was in London last November. I'd been there for the ARC conference that Jordan Peterson put on. And then there was this huge protest going on with 100,000 pro-Hamas people out on the streets. And I went into London to do what I do, wearing my signs. I wear a sign that says children cannot consent to puberty blockers, and one that's my definition of a dad, which is a human male who protects his kids from gender ideology. And I was out on the street, and I just ran into Andy No, who literally wrote the book on Antifa. He's a friend of mine. And I just talked to him for a bit, and I was starting to walk away when this Antifa guy, all masked up, said, "F you, you effing fascist." And so for me, that's an invitation to a conversation. I don't get upset by these things. I did my thing. I started to have a conversation with him, asking him questions, trying to get him to define his beliefs, which of course he can't. And then these three Muslim girls came along, who he was there to support, of course. And they said to him, "What's going on?" He said, "This guy thinks kids can't be trans." And immediately they started laying into him, because of course they can't. And they berated him for about a minute straight, and then he ran away with his tail tucked between his legs. So it was this beautiful, real-life intersectionality clash going on, which really laid out how shallow these allegiances are. But yeah, last September, there was the so-called Million March for Children. It wasn't
Yeah.
a million people, but it was probably 30,000 across the country, which is still tremendous. That was inspired by a protest I'd had in Ottawa a couple months previous, where Muslims had come out for the first time. And that was great. I was happy to work with them. But then since this whole Israel thing happened, a lot of them have shown some pretty negative colors. And now there's this huge rise in anti-Semitism and just pure Jew hatred on the street, and people feeling empowered to just hate Jews, which I'm not okay with at all. So those alliances have kind of died. But yeah, leftism, they just look for any reason to protest, because that's what they do.
Yeah, that is true. We didn't get to, I had asked you a little bit about WPAC. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Right. So WPATH is the World
Oh, sorry,
Professional
PATH.
Association.
Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
World Professional Association for Transgender Health. This is an activist organization with a fancy name. A lot of the members aren't even doctors, but they write what are called the standards of care. And we currently are on the 8th version of their standards of care for so-called trans health. And the most recent version came out in September of 2022. And one thing that happened was, at first, they were actually lowering the age limits for some of these surgeries. They were lowering double mastectomies to the age of 14, for example. And again, these are just guidelines. These aren't rules. Hospitals don't need to follow them. But the American Academy of Pediatrics and these other organizations do tend to cite them, and gender clinics will cite them and claim that they're following their professional standards. Yet, double mastectomies have been done on children as young as 12 years old. But in the initial draft, they had minimum age requirements as a guideline. But then Admiral Rachel Levine, who is the Assistant Health Secretary in the United States, pressured them, this just came out in the last week, pressured them to remove all of these minimum age requirements because it made them easier marks for lawsuits, of course. Because if the age requirements say 15 and then they're doing a surgery on a 13-year-old, well, how do you justify that, Mr. Doctor? Let's take you to court. So they got rid of all the age requirements, and this has now come out that there was direct communication from the Biden administration, from Rachel Levine. And, this is not going to help them, but I remember that very well because we'd actually had a leaked copy of the Standards of Care. I'd caused a big stir back in August of 2022 when I didn't leak out, but I posted these videos from Boston Children's Hospital's own YouTube channel where they talk about doing gender-affirming hysterectomies and oophorectomies, where they cut out their ovaries, and the phalloplasties and the vaginoplasties and all these gruesome videos. And they talk about how kids know they're transgender seemingly from the moment they're born. And it's things like a little girl trying to pee standing up, or a boy who pees sitting down, or siblings trying on a sibling's clothing, a boy trying on his big sister's clothing. These are all signs your child is transgender and can be treated, quote unquote. So these videos really exposed how insane this whole ideology is. And they started off this cascade effect where other conservatives were looking into other children's hospitals. And pretty quickly, the whole conservative movement got educated on this, whereas no one was talking about it before. And this has led to what we see today, 25 states stopping this. But at the time, Boston Children's Hospital was under a ton of pressure. And these new standards of care were coming out. And so they just decided to get rid of their age requirements completely. But they've been exposed, and there are a lot of lawsuits going on, and they are going to lose. So I'm enjoying this moment in time right now.
So I saw you posted a recent decision that came out of Texas where they upheld laws around giving out puberty blockers to minors. Where are you seeing the successes in Canada?
Well, we haven't had a lot of success in Canada. Alberta is the first one to start restricting this, so that's a success. And then also in Saskatchewan and New Brunswick, the premiers want to stop the teaching of gender identity in schools. So that is something that has to happen, because if you're teaching children something, they're going to believe it because they're children. But there's no science to this whatsoever. This is nothing but an ideology. It's essentially a quasi-religion. And we don't teach religion in schools. So we need to get this the heck out. But with our current government in place, federal government, they're all cowards. They won't speak up about this. You mentioned Bill C-4, this conversion therapy bill. So what that bill does is it makes it a criminal offense to object to your child's own transition. They now consider that to be conversion therapy if your child identifies as trans and you want them to identify as cisgender, which is a ridiculous made-up term that we should never use because there's no such thing. But this bill was originally Bill C-6, it was called, and before the last election, it had passed the House. But back then, 62 conservatives voted against it. I think it was 53 conservatives who voted for it. And one of the conservatives who voted for it is a man named Pierre Poilievre. Mm-hmm. He voted for this bill, even when most conservatives didn't. Now, the election was called. The bill hadn't passed the Senate yet, so it died. But then it came back under the new government as Bill C-4, and they didn't even vote on it. They just waved it through unanimously based on a conservative asking them to do it. And not one person objected. And then they also fast-tracked it through the Senate. And then they were literally jumping up and down, weeping and hugging each other in the aisles of Parliament to celebrate this bill, which now made it a criminal offense for a parent to help their child feel comfortable with their body. And Pierre Poilievre has been totally silent until Danielle Smith introduced her desire to stop this. And then in a press conference about 3 months ago, he was questioned 4 or 5 times, and finally, reluctantly, he said he doesn't think children should get puberty blockers. So honestly, that was a huge improvement from him because he'd been totally silent. He's been totally silent since.
Mm-hmm.
He tries to stay out of these cultural issues, right? He just wants to talk about inflation and housing prices, and that's all fine and
Yeah.
dandy. But in 2024, you need to talk about the cultural issues because we essentially have communism creeping in through the back door into all sorts of institutions, and we have to stop it. But he doesn't want to talk about it.
Yeah, well, I think it's actually here. I don't think I mean, it's
Mm-hmm.
continuing to become more and more obvious. One of the concerns that I had, you had mentioned earlier in the interview that, the steps that Daniel Smith has taken were an improvement. However, one of my concerns was that, as part of what she ostensibly was I guess categorized as a parental rights bill. In fact, what I see it quite differently, because she made a statement in her press conference that really concerned me, that she would enforce the child protection laws. And my concern when she says stuff like that in terms of protecting, the feelings of children and what they want to do to themselves, this BC4 came to mind because of what you said, that basically I think the child will end up being taken away from a parent, or the parent could be potentially thrown in jail if they don't affirm their kid, especially with the and it doesn't say parents right now, but it does talk about psychologists and um, you
So I can
know
put these fears to rest
care
because that's
providers.
not what she
Okay.
meant when she was talking about that. And I've actually, I probably shouldn't even say this, but a woman I work with who is the president of the American College of Pediatricians, which is the sensible group of pediatricians. They're much smaller than the American Academy of Pediatrics. But I know that she's been in touch personally with the health minister of Alberta, and they're having great conversations. So, no, Danielle Smith is firmly on board. Proper parental rights, the right to protect your child from this child abuse, not the right to arrest parents who don't want to do this to their children. That's not going to be happening. And I should also add that Bill C4, good luck prosecuting any of these parents. Okay? I would actually love to see a case. They've never arrested anyone under this bill, and I don't think they ever will. Because the real purpose of this bill is to scare people, it's to silence people, and what it does is it puts a chill on the psychotherapeutic profession, because now you have a lot of these counselors who would be
Hmm.
talking to these kids who are too afraid to. Because if you're a counselor treating gender dysphoric children, treating these children with distress, and of course there's always something else going on. I don't even like calling it gender dysphoria because they don't even have real gender dysphoria. They just have distress about something, and usually they have autism and sexual abuse and other things. But a lot of these counselors don't want to talk to these kids anymore because they're afraid of the trans activists coming for their practice and saying they're committing conversion therapy. But in a court case, they would have to define what gender identity is. They would have to dig into this. Wait a minute. So by helping your child feel comfortable with your body, you're committing a crime? Please go ahead and prove that in a court of law. These bills are ridiculous, and we see these bills popping up all over the world, but no one's ever prosecuted. So
Well,
I'm
not
all about
yet, but
parental.
you know, in fairness, I mean, like my experience with how the courts are handling these issues, and more to the point, my profession as a lawyer, we have a law society and many law societies across Canada that are 100% behind this diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they are also one, like we have courts right now that are, the Federal Court of Canada wants you to announce yourself by your pronouns. I've been in court as well, where I've been subject to that request to announce my pronoun at the beginning of court. And my fear around it, while you know I hope what you're saying, and it probably is what she meant by her comments. However, because there's an open door there, I don't really have any faith in our judiciary based on what I've seen and how I've seen COVID handled, and now what I see through the legal profession and with the judiciary around these issues. I'm very concerned that parents um, will be penalized under it. It may not have happened yet, but I'm just concerned that um, those are the measures that are going to be taken if we don't, as you know, have this cultural shift and we're not successful in educating people about the dangers about what's happening right now.
Well, so we will be successful with that, and we are being successful. 4 years ago, almost 4 years ago, when I started my campaign, almost nobody knew what puberty blockers were. They'd never even heard of them. They would see me on the street. They'd say, "What are puberty blockers?" Everyone was confused. They didn't want to believe me when I talked about the things that are happening. We have a lot more evidence than we did back then. And today, I mean, it's just been a massive cultural shift. I get so much support. I get so many emails constantly from parents all across the country who are waking up to this, and they talk to their friends, and not all the teachers are on board with pushing this either. So the bill is really vaguely written, and that's done on purpose. But, you know, Trudeau's toast in the next election. There's no way he's going to win again. The Conservative government will get in there, and what we need to do is ensure that they repeal Bill C4, or at least take out the part about gender identity. The whole bill wasn't needed. There's two components to the bill. There's conversion of sexual orientation and conversion of gender identity. Sexual orientation conversion therapy is not even happening anyway. The whole bill was unnecessary. They put that in there to get broad support for it when the real purpose is gender identity. But they need to repeal that bill. They need to repeal Bill C-16, which made it against the law to discriminate against people based on their gender identity. But again, they can't even define what a gender identity is. Nobody can. So hopefully when Poilievre is in power, he will do that. I do not have much faith that he will, because I don't believe politicians go further than what they promise they'll do when they're campaigning. That's never how this works. But we need to keep moving the Overton window so that this becomes more comfortable for them to talk about, as it already is. He is talking about it more. He's talking about radical ideologies in school a little bit. Again, these are provincial issues, but it's ultimately up to us to create the change that we want in society. We can't rely on some savior in politics. That's not how it works.
Yeah.
People need to run for their own school boards. They need to keep educating people, because we have the truth on our side, and the truth spreads for free, and it's just going to keep spreading. And this ideology, this cult, is going to slowly shrivel away. It'll probably never die completely. There will always be the true believers, but we can certainly reduce it to next to nothing, because the whole thing is a pile of garbage.
I couldn't agree with you more about that. Have you are you familiar with how the detransitioning lawsuits have been going? Have you been following that aspect of
Yes.
anything?
Yes, I talk to all these people all the time. So there's about 20 different lawsuits going on in the States. There's one currently going on in Canada. It's in the beginning stages. There's a law firm in Texas that started up. 4 dads all left their previous law firms. I think they have 17, maybe 18 kids now between them. And they started this law firm just to sue for detransitioners, because they felt a calling to represent these kids and these young adults. So they have 13 or 14 lawsuits going on. There's a woman named Harmeet Dillon who ran to be the chair of the Republican National Committee. She's in San Francisco. She's a great lawyer. She's representing Chloe Cole, another girl named Layla Jane, and I think she has one other lawsuit going on. Chloe had a double mastectomy at 15. Layla Jane had one at 13, both at Kaiser Permanente in Oakland, California. And so their lawsuits are ongoing, and these things take a while to work through the system.
Yes, they do.
But the great thing about this is going to force the American Academy of Pediatrics, WPATH, the American Psychology Association to present their evidence. And as we've seen in some of these state lawsuits, because there are a lot of lawsuits going on in all of these states that have passed legislation to stop this, they don't have the evidence. as we've seen in all the systematic reviews that were done, there is no evidence. So they don't have a leg to stand on. They're going to lose. This is also going to the Supreme Court. And I'm sure other cases with slightly different angles will end up at the Supreme Court as well. But it's simply a matter of time until we stop this. And it's so important to stop this in the US because the rest of the world takes a cue from the US. If it's stopped there, it simply cannot continue in all of these other countries. Western Europe's making great progress. And the cast review, things like this, they're unavoidable. People can't ignore them forever. WPATH and the AAP, they're trying to ignore it. The Canadian Medical Association is trying to ignore it. But we're just going to keep burying them under this avalanche of truth. And when they're buried under it, they can't keep ignoring it. So it just takes time.
It does take time. And I think for myself, the podcast is called Responsibility Quotient for reasons because I really believe that exactly what you said earlier, that there is no savior, there's no political leader. It's up to us as individuals to really push this in our individual lives. And from that perspective, what I do on a routine basis is talk about it whenever I can, when it's necessary for me to do so, including, in my son's school where there was a pride flag. I approached this teacher and asked why it was in the classroom. And she, just, bubbly, well, she believes in inclusivity. And I said, well, it's actually not about that. It's a political ideology, worldview that has no place, or religion that has no place in the classroom. And I think that was the first time she had actually contemplated that perspective.
That's right.
And so, but it is such a polarizing issue. So when you're out doing, speaking with people, have you had the successes where you've seen the light bulb moment go on and you think maybe what you're telling them has made an impact?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I've spoken to 20 or 30,000 people out on the street, so that happens all the time. What you did in the classroom is so important, and I tell parents all the time, go talk to your kid's teacher. You're all concerned about this ideology in schools, but you have never spoken to the kid's teacher.
Yeah.
Go talk to the teacher the first week of school. You should be talking to the teacher anyway to get to know them a little bit. But simply ask them, where do you stand on gender ideology? Because I'm not okay with my kid being taught this in school. And you're going to find out right away where this teacher stands. I've got two girls. They're 12 and 14. One just finished grade 6. One just finished grade 9. I know their teachers, and I know they never taught this stuff because I talked to the teachers. I also caused a big hullabaloo 4 years ago and had the city of Surrey, the top people in the city of Surrey school district reach out to me because I caused a bunch of mayhem. But I met with even the head of Safe Schools for Surrey, BC, and this is one of the biggest school districts in the country. And we met for an hour along with some other head of the Surrey school district. And I had her in tears, almost in tears. She was welling up 3 different times. Not because she was scared, but because she was agreeing with me. And she couldn't believe what was happening to all of these kids. Because most people out there are still normal. They're not all these radical leftists pushing this. Most teachers are still normal. But in every school, of course, you're going to have 1 or 2 very progressive teachers who want to push this stuff. And so you need to make sure that that's not your kid's teacher. And if it is, your kid's in trouble. Like, you need to get them out of that class, especially if your child is autistic. That's not a safe environment for your kid. But yeah, just talk to the teachers and tell them where you stand and have these conversations with your kids. I read to my kids every night. I'm still reading with my little one every night. And it's at that time of day, I think, that's my favorite time of day. This is when they tell you about what happened during their day. Maybe they're just trying to delay bedtime. But you have these great bonding moments. And you can have these little conversations at an age-appropriate level. And just let your kids know about this ideology so that they have the truth, so that when these lies come, they're not going to affect them. But yeah, to answer your question about on the street, most people just don't know much about this, so I just have a normal conversation with them. We see where it goes. For the people who are antagonistic or hostile or on the fence, there are really 2 main strategies for dealing with them. Say things that they agree with. because that confuses them right away. They come up all hostile. And then I say, first of all, I think there's no right way to be a girl or a boy. If a girl's more masculine, if a boy's more feminine, what's wrong with that? And they get so confused because they are not very smart and they think I'm some bigot and that I'm going to be against gender nonconformity. So in that moment, you've confused them. You've caused this cognitive dissonance where there's two competing ideas going on in their brain. And they're going to have to go home and make sense out of that. But the other thing to do with them is to ask them questions, because they never have questioned their beliefs. They've heard these things in university. They've heard these things from their friend groups. They've heard that puberty blockers are reversible. They've heard that kids are going to kill themselves if we don't transition them. These are just two outright lies. And so when you ask them questions and you force them to think about this, it finally gets them to question why they believe the things they do. What is a transgender child? Can you please tell me? What does it mean for a girl to be a boy? And just pause, because they can't answer it. And so you start this process of them thinking, right? And it's very powerful. This is the Socratic method of debate, asking questions, but you have to allow moments to pause. I know I'm rambling on a lot today, but you have to pause and let them think about it. Let those pregnant pauses happen and just say things they agree with. And then they're not going to view you as the enemy right away, and their blood pressure might come down. They might stop shaking and having this adrenaline dump, which happens all the time. And you might be able to get somewhere.
I agree with you. One of the things that I admire about your approach is this calm demeanor and your ability to calmly, rationally ask the questions, and really the reaction that you get is really sad, because in some respects, because you realize just how susceptible these people have been to absolute bullshit, and there really is nothing behind, no substance behind it, yet they've seemed to have captured all of our institutions. And one of the things, and I think it's going to be so important that we really get this right in our schools, because even if we stopped all the nonsense today and we're able to wave a magic wand and correct it, we're still looking at generations of really screwed up people thinking that they can do something that they can't, and that their doctors are supporting it as well, making money off of it, all the rest of it. But at the same time, if we don't get control over this in our education system, I think that it's going to be very challenging to stop it, because our little ones are so impressionable, and they are sponges, and they rely on us to tell them the truth about things. And so is there anything that you can share with us about how we might, apart from obviously being engaged with your child's school or your child's teacher, is there anything else that you think that we might be able to focus on in order to help shift this culture?
Sure. So parents are the first educators of their children. And I think too many times parents outsource the education of their children to the teachers. It's not the teacher's job to teach your kids how to read. It's your job. Yes, the teachers should be doing that, but they have 30 kids, 25 kids.
Yeah.
Sometimes they have an assistant in their classroom. And the kids who are struggling the most are naturally going to take most of their attention. The kids with behavioral issues are going to get a lot of their attention. But your kids should know how to read before they're going to kindergarten. If you're reading with your kids every day, they should already be reading. Now, of course, all kids are at different levels and some get it quicker than others. But it's your job as a parent to teach your kids. And the education system is secondary. My kids are both in public school. They've had no issues whatsoever. They're thriving. My daughter in high school is taking advanced mathematics. She's learned to play the trumpet. She's a very good trumpet player. They have zero issues. And same thing with my kid in elementary school, because we've been conscious of what's going on, and we've talked with our own kids, and we've talked with the teachers, and we're engaged, and they're fine. Now, of course, every child is different, but there's so much doom and gloom about the education system, and it's not all bad. You just need to know who your kid's teacher is. And if you have a bad teacher, yeah, you need to pull your kid out and figure something else out. But just be present with your kids and and make sure that you're not just sitting around watching TV all night, but you're also working with your children, because that's what life is all about. It's about family.
Yes, I agree with you. And you don't have to answer this next question I have, but do you yourself have a faith of your own, a religious or a spiritual faith of your own, or?
Nope, I do not. I am open to there being something, because the universe itself is a mystery, of course. Matter doesn't create itself. It's a fundamental law of physics. But yet here it all is, and here we are. So I don't know what I don't know, but I do know that there's no such thing as a transgender child. They're called girls and boys, and they're beautiful just as they are. That's the positive message we should be sending. And
Yeah,
one more thing I will say also about schools. One of the biggest challenges in Canada, we have this chronic percentage of people who are really far left, more so than other countries. Our unions, I think something like a third of our workers are part of a union. And the unions for all these schools are essentially run by communists. Straight up communists. All the unions are run
yeah.
by communists. It goes hand in hand. I had this protest in Toronto last September. And beforehand, it was also leading up to that big protest across Canada. Beforehand, the Canadian Federation of Labour got together all of the different unions on a Zoom call, which was leaked to my friend Carrie Simpson in Langley, who then leaked it out. But they had about 100 different union bosses on this call. The electrical workers union, the steel workers union, all these guys who would all be against gender ideology, but the union heads, of course, are for it. And what was the purpose of their call? To counter-protest our gender protests. What does this have to do with the steel workers union?
I
Absolutely
know, I
nothing.
know.
But all these communists get together, and all the teachers' unions are run by communists. So they're never going to stop pushing this stuff. So we have to get involved, because
Yeah,
conservatives never get involved in grassroots efforts. Whereas for leftists, like I said earlier, protest is leftist church. Grassroots efforts are what they love to do. So every single school board in this country, every one, is dominated by leftists. I don't think we have a majority conservative school board. So people need to start running for school board, because there's power there. It's only in America and Canada that there are even school boards exist. All these other countries don't have them. So start getting involved at a local level, and we've got to push back, because this is a generational battle. It's not something that's just going to go away. You
yeah.
always have to be fighting back, because they're always going to be fighting for some sort of revolution. And we always have to be present trying to stop them. That's just the way it is.
Well, Chris, I think that this is a good place to end things. I admire what you're doing and your passion and your perseverance so much. And is there any? I mean, obviously, this cause. I don't know. I'm assuming you have a day job of some sort, but
No,
this all
no,
costs
no.
money. No, you
I have
don't.
no day
Okay.
job. I've been doing
This
this.
is
This
this.
is all I do since September 2020. I used to be a financial
So,
advisor, but I've taken the traditional
okay.
career path and gone from financial advisor to crazy sandwich board guy getting punched in the face by Antifa. But I've never been happier, because I'm living a purpose driven life. But no, I have no job. This is my job. I have no income. But if people want to support me, they can do so through my website, billboardchris.com, because I literally survive off the average donation, I think, is $59. And that's keeping me going. But I'm not stopping anytime soon. So I've made a lot of friends all over the world, a lot of media friends, a lot
Yeah.
of conservative organizations, especially in the States. I have a longer term goal to get a proper grassroots movement of conservatives going in Canada, because there's nothing. There are literally no organizations fighting any of this, just
I
small
know.
people here and there. But there's really not one proper organization taking a stand against any of this. And we need to create one of those. So that's a longer term goal of mine.
Well, hey, I would love to help you with that. If
Sure.
if you're looking for people to help, I'm looking. I think it's such an important issue, and for all the reasons that we discussed today. But so let me know what I can do, and I'd love to be part of helping create something to turn this nonsense around. But
All right. I will
and
do.
for my listeners, for the listeners today, I follow Billboard, Chris. I find your posts really gut wrenching sometimes, but sometimes really hilarious. And but at the end of the day, I think your consistency in how you approach it is really something that should be modeled by most of us. I think it's pretty effective. And so if you want to donate to Chris and help him spread this information across the world, you can go to his website, www.billboardchris.com. And Chris, I just want to leave you with the last word. And thank you very much for joining me tonight. And I hope to have you back at some other point with any important updates you want to share.
Thank you so much for having me, Catherine. The last word is this: there is no such thing as a transgender child. We have been subjected to this massive ideology that is pushed by governments, pushed by medical organizations, pushed by nonprofit organizations, pushed by schools. And we think there's some legitimacy to it because it's so big. But the entire thing is based on a lie. There's no truth to it whatsoever, and we shouldn't be afraid to say that, because there are two sexes, zero genders, and infinite personalities, and our children are beautiful just as they are. We need to leave the kids alone, let them grow up. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much. And thanks everybody for tuning in. And next week, I'm going to be having a chat with Eva Chipiak. So stay tuned for that interview, and everybody enjoy their long weekend. Thanks again for coming on. Good night.
Thank you.